Welcome, everyone. Feel free to use the chat function to let us know where you're joining from today. We're delighted to welcome you to our webinar, Interpreters in Language Access Policy, Developments at the Federal, State, and Local Levels. I am Liliana Dinu, the Content and Curriculum Development Specialist at Cross-Cultural Communications, a top U.S. training agency for medical and community interpreting, and creators of Blue Horizon, our dynamic online platform offering both self-paced and live training programs. I'll be your host for this action-packed hour. Joining me today behind the scenes is Zach Williams, our e-learning manager and digital wizard, who will be managing the chat and providing helpful information throughout our session. Today we have ASL interpretation available. Welcome Victoria and Olivia, our interpreters for today's webinar. Thank you both for being here. As we wait for everyone to join, let me quickly highlight some upcoming training opportunities. So please note that CCC operates in the Eastern time zone. To begin with, we have symbols and note-taking, advanced strategies for consecutive interpreting on April 15th and 17th from 6 to 8 p.m. We'll explore symbols for concepts and terminology because your brain deserves a break from memorizing everything. For second training, we have translation for community interpreters on May 3rd and 10th. You'll learn the 10 steps in the translation process and apply essential principles to materials used in community settings. If you register by April 5th, you save $55. For last, we have the Training of Trainers program that starts on July 7th. This licenses you to deliver the Community Interpreter International program with CCC's support. And coming soon, we have the Educational Interpreter Online, a self-paced course for interpreters working in school settings. More information will be available soon. Now for some brief housekeeping information. This webinar will last about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by a 15 to 20 minutes Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature for questions directed to our presenter. And for questions about cross-cultural communications, please use the chat feature instead. Make sure you set your chat to everyone if you want all participants to see your comments. Zach and I will stay on after our presenter leaves to answer any questions about our programs and services. Think of it as our virtual cafe conversation. This webinar has been approved for CEUs, and within 24 hours, you'll receive an email with a certificate of attendance link. Please check your spam folder if you don't see it. Sometimes our certificates like to play hide and seek in there. Certificates are only available for live attendees and must be downloaded within 3 weeks of today's session. After downloading, you can add your name to the fillable field and print it if needed. Now, let's begin our webinar. Our guest today is Jacob Hofstetter, a policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute's National Center for Immigrant Integration Policy. I know, that's a lot. Jacob conducts research related to language access, educational programs, and workforce development for immigrant adults and youth. In the language access space, he analyzes the design and implementation of federal, state, and local policies that aim to expand access to government services for individuals with limited English proficiency. He also researches adult education and workforce programs that promote immigrant integration. Jacob holds a master's degree in global policy studies with a focus on immigration and refugee policy from the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin, and a bachelor in history from Miami University. Jacob, welcome to our webinar. We're delighted to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you to Cross-Cultural Communications for putting on this webinar, and I appreciate that wonderful introduction as well.
Thank you. So we're going to start. We're going to go straight, and it's going to be a discussion. Jake and I will talk about these topics. The first question that I have for you, Jake, is what is the Migration Policy Institute, and why is its research significant for language access policy?
Yeah, of course. So the Migration Policy Institute, or MPI, so we're an independent, nonpartisan think tank that's headquartered in Washington, D.C., though I myself am based out of Boston, Massachusetts. As a think tank, we conduct research and analysis, we convene stakeholders, and we develop policy ideas related to migration, immigration, and integration as well. So this work includes international work on international migration. It includes work on immigration in the United States and also immigrant integration, both within the United States and in other countries as well. So within MPI, I work for the National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy, as you said,
Mhm.
Liliana, which is indeed a
Mhm.
mouthful as well. So our research center at MPI, we focus on issues related to immigrant integration solely in the United States. And that includes issues that affect both immigrants themselves as well as their children, too. And we do our work at the federal level, so things having to do with the federal government, as well as at the state and local level, too. Our work focuses on a number of different systems and policies that intersect with immigrant integration, one of which is language access, as you alluded to when you were talking about my bio as well. And just to share what I think we all have a shared understanding of what language access means, but just when I say that term, what we mean at MPI is taking steps to ensure that language barriers or limited proficiency in English that don't block eligible individuals from
Mhm.
accessing services or information from government programs. So that's sort of how we conceptualize of this issue. Um, in terms of my own background, I've been at MPI for, it'll be 5 years in May, and a large portion of my research at MPI focuses on language access. Before that, I also worked on the issue of language access in Massachusetts as an advocate, specifically in the child welfare system and also in the courts. So that's MPI in a nutshell and a little bit about myself as well. But what does MPI's work mean for in practice for folks who are working in the language access, either as language professionals or in other positions as well? So our research institute can be a source of information, data, updates, and recommendations related to language access. As I mentioned at the top, we're independent and nonpartisan. We're not an advocacy organization. We're a research institute. And our work on language access focuses on a few things. I'm going to talk about these in a little bit of detail right now. This isn't just to toot my own horn or talk about our research in depth, but I also think because this will provide some useful context to the things I know you want to ask me about later on as well, Liliana.
Definitely. And I didn't know half the things you're telling me right now, even though I researched you and I read about the MPI. And so thank you. It's totally useful.
Yeah, of course. There's a lot to dig into, so for sure.
Hmm.
Um, so first, a lot of our work at the Center on Language Access focuses on the federal government's actions and policies related to language access, a lot of which has to do with U.S. civil rights laws and regulations. We've previously published research on what the existing and policy framework for language access at the federal level looks like and what some opportunities for improvement are. And I know we're going to dig into that a little bit too. And as I mentioned, so our center works at the federal level. We work at the state and local levels as well. So we also work a lot on state and local level efforts or policies related to language access. So just given the reality of federalism in the United States and how it affects government programs that are delivered to the public, state and local efforts are really key to this issue. And I think you can sort of conceptualize it in this way, like how often do you get services directly from the federal government? Of course, there are things where that happens, like Social Security, like getting a passport, hearing from FEMA, or some other really important functions that the federal government has where they're interfacing directly with the public. But I think in a lot of cases, much of the time, if not most of the time, folks in the United States are getting services and information from state and local governments, whether that's a county, a city, a town, a state, etc. For example, as I mentioned, I live in Boston, so I end up interacting mostly with the city and state government programs where I live. And our work at the state and local level, like as you can imagine, really focuses on understanding what state and local governments are doing to try and increase language access in the programs they deliver to the public. We've done some previous research that's focused on how states and localities design and implement policies and laws related to language access. And we're going to be having some more on that come out in the next few months as well. So stay tuned
Hmm.
on that as well. Um, And
Mhm.
so I just wanted to provide sort of that context to the different layers of our work at the center, because I think that's really going to inform the conversation that I know we're going to be having today about federal policy, about the recent executive order, and about state and local policy as well.
Mhm. That definitely gives us a great foundation. Um, as you can imagine, for interpreters and for immigrants, this information is not a given. So I think it's important as interpreters to know that we have an organization like yours that supports our work. And so thank you. Now let's turn to policy specifics. So could you provide a comprehensive analysis, obviously, during this webinar of the federal legislative framework that governs and shapes interpreter services in the United States?
Sure, happy to do so. And in the time we have, this is something that we could talk about the whole time, but I'll try to give sort of a
Mhm.
brief overview. And I just want to acknowledge there is the elephant in the room, which is the recent Trump executive order, which has introduced some changes to this. But I think it's really important to sort of understand what the policy framework around language access at the federal level looked like before the recent executive order from the Trump administration, just so we can fully understand what the impacts are.
Mhm.
So thinking about language access in federal programs, right? I think it's really helpful if you think of two types of programs at the federal level. The first one is what I'll call federally delivered programs. And the second one is what I'll call federally funded programs. And I'll note that sometimes people refer to these in different ways. I just chose those terms because I think they're the most sort of accessible to think about. And so, as you can think about these two types of programs, again, federally delivered and federally funded. So the federal government has different policies, or perhaps better said, they have different approaches related to language access in each of these. So let me define what I'm talking about with each of these
Mhm.
programs. And I think as I sort of talk about it, it'll be clear how language access fits into each of these. So,
Mhm.
federally delivered programs are those that, as the name suggests, are services and information that the federal government delivers directly to the public. I mentioned this a little bit above, but here you can think about things like Social Security, the IRS or Internal Revenue Service, immigration processing or enforcement, federal courts, information from FEMA related to disasters, maybe from the
Mhm.
CDC. And again, it's not just services necessarily where you walk into an office and get a service. It can also include public communications or information. For example, if you've ever seen like a recall of a specific vegetable if issued by the FDA, that's information that the federal government's, of course, delivering to the public.
Mhm.
And in these cases, federal agencies are or if they're seeking to provide language access, they have to do it on their own. So they have to have either bilingual employees or contracted interpreters to translate it or translators to help them deliver multilingual services and information to the public. So that's federally delivered programs. Now, federally funded programs, this is a little bit different. So these are those that also, as the name implies, are federally funded, either entirely or partially by the federal government, but then they're actually delivered to the public by a different entity. So that could be a state or local government, that could be a nonprofit organization, it could in some cases be a for-profit company as well, something like a hospital. It can really depend on the sector, right? It's just any type of entity that's getting federal funding. So these are government programs that federal agencies fund, oversee, provide assistance to, and monitor as well to make sure they're using the funds correctly and achieving the goals of the programs they're being funded for. But they're not programs that the federal government's delivering directly to folks, right? They're programs they are funding, programs that they're supporting. For example, you can think about SNAP here or food benefits or Medicaid, right? These are funded by the federal government and overseen by federal agencies, but the actual money goes to states who either deliver the services themselves or grant that money out to local governments or nonprofits to deliver those services as well.
That gives them the freedom of choosing which service to fund more or how and all of those
Yeah,
details.
exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. So just thinking about this in Massachusetts, for example, Massachusetts is a little unique. We don't have counties here. Most things are delivered by the state. But for example, the federal government is granting funds to the state for different types of programs. And then either the state's delivering those directly to the public, or maybe they're having a request for proposals, a grant competition to give those funds out to nonprofit organizations. And so that's the way that federal funds are kind of flowing down to support different government services as well.
I see. That's interesting because you read about it, but like hearing it from someone explained in detail, that is really helpful. Regarding President Trump's recent executive order pertaining to language access services, could you elaborate on its provisions and potential ramifications for the interpreting profession?
Sure. So we have to keep in mind that there's these federally delivered programs, and then there's the federally funded programs as well. So
Mhm.
just to back up really quickly too, um, people who receive federal funding, they have a requirement to offer language access, and that comes from federal civil rights laws and regulations. This is just important to talk about before we get into the executive order.
Mhm.
Um, and so federally funded programs are required to take steps to make sure that individuals are not blocked from participating in their programs solely because they have limited proficiency in English. And so it's just important to note that this stems from federal civil rights law, Supreme Court decisions, and other regulations. Specifically, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act is a big one. Um, I know a lot of folks on this call also work on healthcare. So obviously Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act is a really important one that requires certain steps to be taken related to language access in the healthcare setting as well. So the executive order, I think it's really helpful to think about these federally delivered programs and then the federally funded programs, because the executive order kind of comes into here and disrupts one of them, but not necessarily the other one. So as
Hmm.
you mentioned, Liliana, on March 1st, the Trump administration executive issued an executive order that, as I'm sure a lot of you heard, designated English as the official language of the country. So that designation or that declaration is largely symbolic, but it is, of course, notable. It's the first time in the history of the US that we've had a nationally designated language, though some states do have their own laws that designate English the official language as well. But the
Mhm.
Trump executive order also brought some really real policy changes when it comes to language access in federal programs. And again, this is somewhat complicated, but I'm going to dig into this as much as I can. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions about this as well. Okay, so let's just talk about the main things that the executive order does. And I think, first of all, it's important to note that the executive order makes it really clear that federal agencies do not have to change anything about how they deliver services or information. Agencies can still provide multilingual services and information. There's nothing that forbids that in the executive order. Now let's get into the weeds. So what the executive order does do is that it repeals a previous executive order from the Clinton administration, which was number 13166. And this was a
Mhm.
really key part of the federal government's approach to dealing with language access. This executive order has existed since President Clinton. It's largely been upheld by bipartisan administrations. Even the first Trump term, that executive order was kept in place. Um, so what does repealing that executive order do? So first, this doesn't affect the obligation of federally funded programs to take steps to provide language access. So state and local programs are still bound by those obligations. The executive order doesn't implicate those at all. So for example, a local SNAP program doesn't all of a sudden not offer language access, for example. The executive order doesn't say that, and federal law and regulations still require that from people who get federal funds as well. But the executive order will have a bigger impact on federally delivered programs. Again, that's those programs that the federal government is delivering itself directly to the public. So those types of programs, again, the ones that the federal agencies themselves are delivering directly to the public, were required to take steps to provide language access by Executive Order 13166, that Clinton era executive order. But now they're no longer required to do so. They can do so, as the Trump executive order makes very clear. They still can provide language access. However, those requirements have been taken back, and the administration has said that it's done this in order to provide more flexibility for agency leadership to decide what makes the most sense for them related to language access. Now, so these requirements have been taken back, right? Language access for federally delivered programs, for the most part, has become you can do this instead of you must do this, right? So exactly what this will lead to, we don't know. So this could range from very little efforts to provide language access um, in federally delivered programs. But in theory, federal agencies could basically keep doing what they've been doing to provide language access as well. We don't really think it's going to be the latter. We think this will really be a question of to what extent federal agencies will stop their efforts to provide language access. Again, in the programs that they deliver directly to the public. So, for example, To what extent will the Internal Revenue Service keep attempting to provide translated forms is now really left to the discretion of agency heads, right? So they find themselves with this new flexibility to decide the extent to which they want to provide
Mhm.
language access.
So, like,
But
for example, here in Florida, so if we have a hurricane coming, each county or each organization is going to have to choose if they're going to, give their warnings in English only, or they're going to decide, oh, we have a high community, like a large community of Spanish speaking population. So we're going to deliver the notices in Spanish too. Kind of like the same thing, what you were saying, right?
well, not exactly actually, because those are county agencies. So they're getting federal funds. So
Oh,
they're
so that's
still required to do
funded
so. But
versus delivered.
the federal agency itself, FEMA, for example, will have more flexibility. Now, the one thing I will note is that this is really, really getting into the weeds. But in
Hmm.
some cases, federal agencies are actually required by different parts of federal law to offer language access. So in a few
Hmm.
cases, there might be some federal agencies that still legally have to offer language access. But what that executive order from the Clinton administration was it was like a blanket requirement for
Hmm.
all agencies. And so now that blanket requirement has been removed. So yeah, you're correct. If so, in the case of an emergency communications, for example, everyone who receives federal funds still has to provide language access.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I didn't know that. So
This
now
is very complicated, so I totally
it is.
understand.
Sorry, I was getting us into opening a can of worms that I don't really want to be in. So, now going on to state and local governance structures, could you explain how they establish their own district policies for interpreter services and what notable regional variations exist across the country?
Sure. I know there's a couple questions in the Q&A about the executive order as well. So after I talk about state and local, maybe we could just address any of those specific questions too.
Of course.
Um, so again, state and local programs that receive federal funding still have to provide language access. Or that is to say that the um, existing obligations are still there to take
Mhm.
steps to provide language access. Um, there's another piece of the executive order that I think is important to say as well before I get into state and local too, which is that the executive order also rescinded guidance documents related to language access that the federal government previously had. Those are going to be reissued as well. Um, so we're just going to have to see exactly what the new guidance from the federal government is for people who get federal funding about what to do about language access. But that's a big question mark at this point. But I just want to note that that's something to consider as well.
Mhm.
Okay, now for states and localities.
Mhm.
So, as I talked about at the start, so states and localities often work on language access on their own initiative. This is partially because of these federal requirements that we've been talking about, but it's also due to hearing from the communities that states and localities serve, and also just witnessing the need for language access in a lot of the programs that they deliver as well. So these state and local policies and efforts usually seek to ensure language assistants like interpreters are in place, and to have efforts sort of at the back of the house to coordinate and monitor language access across their agencies or programs too. So it might be a city doing this, it might be a state, it might be a county as well. For example, in Boston, we have a local ordinance about language access, and it requires agencies to take steps to provide bilingual employees or interpreters or translated materials as well. And then agencies' efforts are overseen by a specific office in Boston, just to make sure that agencies are getting the help they need, that they're taking the steps they're supposed to, and that basically they're coordinated appropriately and have some oversight as well.
Mhm.
So these state and local efforts are, although they're in some ways related to these federal requirements, um, they're actually separate and they are not eliminated or forbidden by the new Trump administration executive order by any means. So state and local laws and policies on language access are still in place. We at MPI, I authored a report back in 2021 that tried to detail all of the state and local laws and policies on this, which I'm happy to share that in the chat as well. Um, and so these laws and policies aren't disrupted. In fact, they're actually probably going to be even more consequential as the federal government pulls back from working on language access a little bit as well.
Mm, okay.
Um, I'm wondering, I just want to look at the
Yeah,
Q.
we have a couple questions if you'd like to get to them right now. So Grace is asking, how do you suggest LAPs and LEPs navigate all of the legal changes and challenges that are happening? Could these change the way hospitals, courts, etc., schedule and handle the seriousness of language access for all?
I mean, it's a really good question. I think what we face now is a lot of uncertainty, and it's important to focus on the things that we do know. And we do know that federally funded institutions, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a county human service office, whether it's a city department that receives federal funds, they are all still um, required to take these steps related to language access, to take steps to make sure there's language access in their programs. So that requirement has not changed. Um, and uh, Now, as to how those state and local programs, even if they're still required to offer language access, we have heard anecdotally that some have been confused by the new executive order. And there's a lot of good resources and explainers out there. I just wrote an article that came out yesterday, kind of explaining the executive order and what it means um, for different entities, whether that's federal agencies or state and local programs as well. And I think really ensuring that folks have accurate information about what the executive order means is a really important step there.
Mhm. That is important. And thank you for answering that question. I had the same question at some point too. The next question is by Aida, and she is asking if USCIS is federally delivered program service and they should have provided language assistance, as you mentioned. How is it that they require applicants to bring their own interpreters to their green card and citizenship interviews? This was true up to now in Kentucky.
So this is a very hot topic when it comes to the federal language
Mhm.
access space, small as we are. Um, just to say that this is something that was raised during the previous administration. The ACLU did a lot of work noting that USCIS is based on Executive Order 13166 is required to provide language access. And again, this is under the previous administration. So it doesn't make sense that they have this policy to require individuals to bring their own interpreters. That was what the ACLU and some other advocacy groups were saying. I'm not sure how that was resolved. I think the election happened, and those efforts have diminished now. And obviously, with the executive order being revoked, there actually isn't that a lot of those requirements have changed as well. So just to say that there is some dissonance there, of course, and I think folks have been advocating and raising a lot of that dissonance. However, we However, I don't think it's been solved in any real way, nor would I anticipate it. It's actually sort of becoming harder to solve with the recent executive order.
Hmm, I see. Um, Another question would be, how are federal court language access, I lost the question right now. How are federal court language access affected by the executive order? Will they still be funded for those delivered programs or have to fund themselves?
Yeah, I'm hesitant to talk about really specific federal programs and how what the impact will be for a few reasons. One is that some federal programs still have requirements to offer language access, even after Executive Order 13166 has been revoked. And the second piece is we don't necessarily know what federal agencies are going to do. So a lot of this is going to depend on what the leadership of agencies decide to do related to language access. So it's just a little too early to say either way exactly what will happen with specific programs.
We have a few people inquiring pretty much about the same thing, but in the educational realm. So basically, what happens in the educational setting? Do they still have to provide language access to students and families? Are they still required?
The requirements are still in place. Of
Hmm.
course, a lot of the staff that worked on these issues at the Department of Education has been laid off by DOJ. And it's unclear who will be enforcing requirements in the future. But the requirements are still there. They're still on the books and still apply to recipients of federal funding.
Mm-hmm. There's another question that says, what impacts besides the Trump executive order the IA would have for interpreters in the future? This
I
is
think that
a
might be AI, right?
confusing, yeah, that's IA. Um, yeah, that's a confusing one, but what will happen in federal courts or with the IRS, Social Security Services, offices of Congress, and so on?
So yeah, so I think I saw some of the questions too, and I think that we'll be covering those, and maybe like the AI one we can talk a little bit more about at the end as much as I
Mhm.
can. I think at this point, just broadly speaking, if you're asking about any specific federal agency that delivers services to the public is going to do, the answer is just like what we're going to have to see. It's going to depend on what their leadership decide. They're going to have a lot more leeway in a lot of cases to be able to decide the extent to which they're working on language access. For folks who are receiving federal funding, though, like I said, those requirements are still in place. The executive order has not disrupted those requirements under the Civil Rights Act and in some cases under federal laws in addition. Um, so again, I think if you're asking about specific federal agencies and what they're doing, we're just going to face some uncertainty and we'll have to see how things play out. Like I said, the executive order does not forbid federal agencies from working on language access. But it doesn't say, it just says that they're no longer required to. So again, part of that is just waiting to see how they respond.
Mhm. There's another question. For example, with the new policy, the state and local agencies can provide the language assistance. Can federal money be used to cover those expenses?
I'm not sure I'm actually able to answer that.
Mhm.
I think that will depend. But yeah, I don't actually fully know the answer to that question. It's a really good question. But I don't want
Mhm.
to give incorrect information about that.
Yeah. So, how many questions do you still want to answer before we call?
Maybe we should maybe we can move on and then we can go back and see what other ones are there as well.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Let's talk about funding. Where does public funding for language services come from, and how do budget decisions impact interpreters?
Right. So this is really just overall, this is a really complicated topic, and it's hard to describe. I'll say there's a lot of unknowns throughout it and a lot of variation throughout the country. I won't attempt to sort of know every single to say that I know every single detail about this, but I think I can sort of provide a broad interview overview based on our research. So I think just thinking on the sort of most conceptual level, so whoever is delivering a government program to the public is the one who's thinking about how to budget and deliver those services and information. So that's
Mhm.
a large number of things, correct? That's how many staff do you hire? That's where your office is located, how much online material you're making, et cetera. All these operational details that are going to come into running a program. For example, you can think about all the functions of a hospital or a school or a county human service agency that go into here. And so a very small sliver, a very small part of that is how to provide language access and
Mhm.
how to budget for providing language access as well, which again, as folks know, may be from bilingual staff that you're using to provide services directly in another language or contracting with language services companies or individual interpreters or translators. So in those cases, the extent to which language access is being budgeted for really depends on the location, the population it serves. For example, the budget for hiring interpreters at a human services a nonprofit in the Bronx is going to be different than in, for example, rural South Dakota, right? So geography, the number of LEP individuals that's individuals with limited proficiency in English that providers interact with, a lot of that goes into these budget decisions as well. Talking a little bit more about local governments and how they think about it. So this is something that I'll be having some research come out on, hopefully in the next month or so. And we really see that local governments approach language access in different ways. Some have sort of a centralized pot of money that they use for all their expenses related to language access. And the vast majority of expenses related to language access are from using contracted interpreters or translators, whether that's independent interpreters or translators, or whether that's from a larger company. Um, and then, of course, some of that goes to just staff who are hired specifically to work on language access, though that varies from place to place. So, like I said, some places have sort of the centralized pot of money that agencies use, whereas other localities will have each agency figure out their own budget decisions related to language access. And then to make this even more complicated, when you're looking at how agencies do this, some have, again, their own little pot of money that they say this is for language access, or others, they might just have administrative or operational funding that they pull from to pay for expenses related to language access. Um, so obviously increases or decreases in appropriations or budget decisions impacts the amount of funding available to use to hire language professionals. Um, and it can vary, like some places have really tight resource. Well, every government program has resource constraints, right? Whereas some have much more intense or acute resource constraints and may have less funding available to hire language professionals, whereas others may have this be more part of their dedicated funding. Again, I think a lot of times that has to do with just the extent to which they interact with folks who need interpreters or translated materials as well. I will say that from my research, it's pretty clear that when community members and constituents are asking for funding for language access, when agency leadership are aware of the need for language access, and also when the elected officials, whether that's at the local or state level or even federal level, are aware of the need for language access and sort of bought into it, I think all of that helps with funding decisions and having more funding for these programs. I will say that a lot of governments do favor using bilingual or multilingual employees in a lot of cases, just
Mhm.
because they don't face the same expense that they would from hiring an interpreter or translator. Of course, there is a challenge with that as well, which is that a lot of cases, bilingual or multilingual employees weren't hired to provide to solely serve as interpreters or provide services directly in languages other than English. And so that can be a challenge in and of itself as well. But just to note that that's something that does come up a lot in this space too.
Right. That's helpful context. And building on that, how do Title VI and state-specific laws affect interpreters, and what should they know about these regulations?
Yeah, so I think we have covered a bit of this before, but just to say again that I think sort of the biggest takeaway for me as I look at this is just there's such a large swath of government programs that are covered by Title VI. As that money's coming from the federal government, it's going flowing down to a state agency, and then it's either granted out to local or being used by the state agency itself. With those federal dollars, Title VI and its language access requirements are attaching to it. Even if you're a subgrantee for federal funds, so for example, like the federal funds go to a state agency and then they're granted to a local agency, and even if your program isn't entirely funded by federal dollars too. And so I think it's really worth when you sort of conceptualize this, knowing those two things. The federal dollars reach all across the country and they reach really deeply into a lot of different government programs. A large number, if not most, state, county, city, town, nonprofit service providers receive federal funds and are going to be covered by these requirements. So that's in things like healthcare, education, human services, law enforcement, and the courts, emergency services, etc. So what this just means is that there should be a lot of demand for language services in many parts of the country because of these obligations to provide language access. And I also will just note that there's this practical need and practical benefit to providing language access. I don't want to frame this entirely in terms of just complying with federal civil rights requirements, because language access and providing multilingual materials, as I'm sure folks working in the interpreting profession are more than aware, brings
Mhm.
benefits as well to the individuals you're providing interpreting for. It makes government programs more effective, in some cases more efficient. And it also just ensures that, it can bring collective benefits too, making sure that public safety and public health, that accurate information is being released about those topics. And also just making sure that folks aren't being denied access to things that will help their well-being, their health, their economic mobility, solely because they're not fully proficient in English, for example. And you asked about state laws too, and I'll just say that really, when you think about that, state laws, and in some cases local laws, are just sort of layering in more
Mhm.
requirements, a lot of times more specific requirements related to language access as well. Like you have to have a qualified bilingual staff member or interpreter to serve LEP individuals when they come in, for example.
Mhm. Let's quickly, I think we're not gonna make it to all of the questions that we have scheduled
Oh
for
no.
today. And so we're gonna shift quickly to data's role in this space. How does the government use data to allocate funding for language access services? If you could answer that quickly, and then we can go on to the next one.
Sure. I'll be as quick as I can. So basically, most of the time, governments are using data for two things. One is to prepare and to understand the size of the multilingual population in their area and
Mhm.
understanding like what are the languages I have to be prepared to serve in a lot of cases. And the second one is sort of that. So if that's sort of preparation, the other one is more like monitoring or reflection. So a lot of times governments are tracking how many times did I hire an interpreter? What languages did I do that for? Um, or how many interactions did we have with limited English proficient individuals in a particular instance? So that's a lot of the ways that data can be useful. And I'll say as well that we at MPI put out a lot of data on language access as well. We use census data and basically help organize it and publish it for folks. I'm happy to share some of that, but if you go to our data hub and you look at our state immigration data profiles, there's a whole section on language and education in which you can find sort of the number of LEP individuals and the languages they speak for every state in the country as well.
Which was going to be my next question.
I
What
know, I got ahead
API
of you.
data resources are available for interpreters? So thank you for answering that ahead of time. We can probably move on to practical advocacy. How can interpreters engage with advocacy groups, legal aid organizations, and maybe even immigrant rights coalitions?
Sure. So maybe for here, I think engaging is sort of up to how folks want to get involved as well. Like I said, we're a nonpartisan research institute, so I'll maybe it's best for me to just sort of describe the different types of groups that are working on this. So
Mhm.
there's national advocates who work on language access. There's state advocates as well. And when you look at both of these types of advocacy groups, a lot of times they're groups that are working on promoting immigrant rights. Sometimes there are groups that are specifically focused on communities that have a lot that are linguistically diverse, whether that's Latino communities, whether that's AAPI communities as well. In addition, a lot of civil rights groups will sometimes work on language access. And sometimes groups that work specifically on sectors, for example, like healthcare, will do work around language access as well. Similar at the state level too, as you can imagine. And then the base of a lot of language access work too is with service providers. So that can be legal aid organizations, as well as community-based organizations as well, who are not just providing services in a lot of cases to multilingual individuals, but taking steps to try and improve systematic efforts by, in a lot of cases, state and local governments to do better in providing language access as well.
Mhm. I see. To follow it up, I'm not sure if you really answered this question, but what specific organizations, if you could name any, work to promote language access rights and the ones that interpreters should at least know about and acquaint themselves with?
I mean, there's just so many that it's
Hmm.
hard to describe in a lot of cases. I think if you're in a state, and if you want to look in your specific state, you can look at like an immigrant rights coalition in your state. In a lot of cases, that'll help you find sort of people in your local area who might be doing this type of work.
Okay, that's helpful because sometimes we don't know exactly. Google is, metaverse. So if we type in something, a lot of information comes out that we may not be able to use. So that's important to know. If we type into Google exactly this, we might get
A
more
good, I do have a
relevant.
shortcut as well, which is there's an organization called the National Partnership for New Americans, or
Hmm.
NPNA, and they're an umbrella organization that coordinate and help uh, immigrant advocacy and immigrant rights organizations across the country. So if you go to their website, you can actually find all their different members, and that can be really helpful in seeing, okay, who's working on immigrant issues in different states. Not necessarily all their members are working on language access. It is in area of interest for a lot of them. But it's kind of a good way to see who might be working on this in your specific area.
And I'm sure those type of websites are a hub of information, and you can go on and read and research, do your own personal research on it. So thank you. Now, for a broader perspective, having lived in Europe and gained insights on multilingualism, how do you think the recent establishment of English as the official language of the US shapes public awareness of language access rights? And why does multilingualism still seem more deeply integrated into the public consciousness in parts of Europe compared to the US? It's a complex question.
Yeah, no,
From
this
a
is
European,
a
I'm
really
interested.
great and interesting question from a European as well. Um, So I'll say a few things maybe more from the MPI perspective, and I can share my own perspective as well. But the data really shows that census data in particular really shows we live in a very multilingual country, right? And that's just a reality. It's not just immigrants as well. There's plenty of groups, whether Puerto Ricans, Native Americans, those who use ASL, whose English is either not their first language or English is one language that they share as well. Not to mention the millions of folks who are US born citizens but have immigrant parents and may be bilingual or multilingual as well. All to say there's millions of multilingual Americans. There's a regional consideration to this as well. Parts of the country, like Miami, are virtually bilingual. If you live in an immigrant heavy neighborhood or city or region, I think in a lot of cases the country may not seem quite as not as monolingual as is presented. Um, so what does this mean for language access? Um, I think just in general, language access in a lot of cases, it almost seems like sort of a next level of consciousness for folks. And this is something that I've talked about as well, that it's not just understanding this is a civil rights requirement or my locality requires me to do this. It's also government staff having more understanding of cultural exchange, understanding that there's other languages they will encounter, understanding some of the nuances of working with speakers of of languages other than English. That I know a lot of folks on this call who work as interpreters. This is your all stage job, but just I think it comes kind of naturally for folks, and it's just such an obvious thing for folks who work on these issues. But I think for those who are more removed from these issues, it's not as clear sometimes about why things like translation are important, how translation is more an art in a lot of cases than a science as well. So I think these are really important things to consider. Um, and just from my own perspective too, because you did ask from my own perspective, it's just I think like language learning is a big piece of it. Like I think language learning in general is not as there's lots of multilingual individuals in the United States, but language learning is not as common in the United States as in Europe for the most part. Like where a large number of individuals learn English, which is not their native language, from the on-go. And like I think there's a lot of reasons for that you can dig into, but I think it's also, and I think this ties into thinking about language access and thinking about diversity as well, that a lot of this may be a function of just how in the United States, how dominant at the same time English is and how large the country is as well. Like I could get on a plane to Seattle and get off and they would be speaking the same language 3,000 miles away. But if you were to fly from like Madrid to Romania, for example, about maybe a little
Mm-hmm.
shorter distance or similar distance, you would be speaking a completely different language. So I think there's sort of a practical or functional level of that as well.
I see. And just one last question from me, and then we'll go to the Q&A for the rest of the time. Looking ahead, what do you think the future looks like for language access in the next few years?
Well, so I'll talk about two time frames. One is under this current administration, and then the other one is in the longer time frame, right? So under this administration, it's really uncertain what's going to happen at the federal level, as I said. And language access is just a small piece of the broader uncertainty that I think a lot of us are experiencing. I think it's fair to say that state and local efforts on language access will likely continue. Um, and even under this administration, there's a possibility that things related to language access don't change too much. It's also possible we see dramatic shifts. Like I said, I don't mean to be wishy-washy with this either.
Mhm.
I don't know that's a little bit of a cop out, but just I think it's hard to make sort of predictions about how this will play out beyond saying like we'll have to see in a lot of cases at the
I
federal level.
think this administration is very unpredictable, to be honest. So,
Yes.
yeah. Hmm.
But looking ahead to the future, I think if you take the long view, you can see that the past 25 years have seen really a large amount of growth and momentum related to language access at all levels of government, federal, state, and local levels. Um, and there's been a lot of time for awareness to build about why language access is important. There's a lot of time for government officials to see how critical language access is. For example, COVID was a wake-up call for a lot of governments that, language access isn't just something nice that you do when people walk through your doors. It's also something critical for being able to communicate with the public as well, if you live in a linguistically diverse area. So I think we will just have to see if the recent policy shifts at the federal level disrupt this trajectory or disrupt the momentum and progress that we've seen over the past 25 years. It's also possible that federal policy on this will change in 4 to 5 years if there's a different administration. So I think that we're looking at a period of uncertainty and disruption. It's just not clear exactly how long that will be as well. And I actually saw somebody note this in the chat as well. And I think it's an important note to perhaps close on is that, action uh, creates reaction as well.
Mhm.
And I think that efforts, maybe the federal government, it's possible that as the federal government pulls back more on language access, that states and localities do more efforts to try and fill that gap as well. We'll just have to see. But I think there's a lot of different possibilities for the way that things go.
Thank you for those insights. You've given us a lot to think about. Yeah, what you were saying, definitely, I think the official order brought attention to the fact that many people didn't know we didn't have an official language. So that to begin with is a huge thing. So hopefully, everything goes in the right direction and we can just be excited about the future. Let's open the floor to questions from our audience. So I have this one question. Who checks that language access policies are being followed?
That's a great question. So there's a few ways to think about this. So let's just talk about at the federal level. So if you're receiving federal funds and you have these obligations to take steps to provide language access, um,
Mhm.
the way that that's checked, sort of broadly speaking, and I'm speaking like this is very specific, but I'm going to try and be general so we don't spend the rest of the webinar talking about this, is generally the civil rights offices within federal agencies are the
Mhm.
ones that are responsible for monitoring this. They're the ones that take complaints and investigate complaints related to language access as well. At the state and local level, it can be um, a variety of different offices who are
Mhm.
taking steps to make sure that agencies are providing language access, but that generally only applies in places that actually have these official policies related to language access. I think is important to note too. Sometimes in federal programs, they'll have their own checks or pieces that are making sure folks are taking steps to provide language access, but that's not uniform necessarily across federal programs. And just one other thing I want to note that I think is really important to say as well. It's really difficult to bring lawsuits about language access, like other civil rights violations. There's ways that
Mhm.
you can bring lawsuits, but with language access, it's very complicated to get into. And I'm also not an attorney, so I don't want to get too much into the weeds. But just to say that it is difficult to bring lawsuits based on this as well.
Right, right. I'm aware of that, unfortunately. Another question would be, what about requirements that lose federal funds as part of efforts to close the Department of Education? That's a very specific one. Um, do you think you have an answer?
Can you say that question one
So
more
what
time?
about the requirements? So basically, the schools are required to provide language access, but they lose federal funds as part of the efforts to close the Department of Education, if that were ever to be the case.
There's a lot of hypotheticals in there, so I'm a little
Mhm.
hesitant to answer it.
To answer, that's what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and then do you know how and if the executive order will impact the Medicaid program reimbursing private hospitals, clinics for their use of in-person staff interpreters? No impact or funding reduced or cut?
I can't really answer that question right now. The executive
Mhm.
order doesn't specifically forbid anything like that. And because that has to do with federal and state policy, I'm not sure how it'll be impacted. But that is a great question.
Yeah. Um, how do consumer protection laws figure in this in the discussion of language access? That's a very interesting one.
It's a really good
Um,
question. I just unfortunately I
mhm.
don't think I can answer that one.
Yeah, there's a lot of them. You guys have really good questions,
You do, and I
and
feel bad that I
I
can't
would
answer any of
spend
them.
time here reading through all of them. Any reports as to how much use or not of interpreters is taking place during the current wave of deportations? Is that
There's
something
no,
that
I
you?
haven't heard any data or any concrete
Mhm.
information on the use of interpreters. Um, I'll say that this has been an issue in the immigration enforcement system for a very
Mhm.
long time, under a lot of different administrations. And yeah, I don't expect that to change.
And another question, requiring clarification. Could you repeat the difference between agencies receiving federal funds and federal agencies directly providing services?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So federal agencies directly providing services is when a member of the public is getting services or information directly from a federal agency itself. So the Social Security Administration, for example, is the federal agency that you would go to and you would get services from, right? Or the FDA would, if they're announcing a recall of cucumbers, for example, that would be information that you're getting directly from the federal government. That's a little different than organizations or governments who get federal funding, like, say, a city government who has some obligations to provide language access because of civil rights law. However, it's a federally funded service, but it's being delivered not by the federal government, which I know this is that can be kind of confusing to think about, but that's why I like saying
Yeah.
federally funded because I think it gives you the sense of they're receiving federal dollars, but it's being delivered by someone else.
Hmm. No, that is complicated. If you're not in the topic every day and working with it, it's very easy to lose track and misunderstand. So there's a question saying, I heard from a recruiter of a language provider that they can only hire US-based interpreters due to the new Language Act. Is it true? Is there, yeah, I don't know what that's a
There's nothing in the
language
executive
act.
order that says that.
Right. Right. That's what I thought.
I won't
And
speak to other federal laws or regulations that might impact that, but there's nothing in the executive order that says.
mhm. Um, any concerns about how the 2030 US Census and the ability to capture LEP numbers and diversity of languages spoken, for example, real data? I'm trying to understand this question a little bit better.
Well, I can speak a little bit to that.
Hmm.
The census data and American Community Survey data is really foundational to understanding the need for language access in a lot of cases. Um, it's really, all levels of government and providers use it to figure out how many individuals are limited English proficient in their area and what are the major languages. So if that were to be disrupted, then that would be really harmful, I think, to the efforts of a lot of state and local governments and really everyone who's attempting to provide language access to do that.
Hmm. There's another question that I think most of us are asking themselves right now. There's a fear in the medical interpreter community that the administration may further impact language access. What can we do to get involved in the work towards ensuring language access?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the second part of the question?
So, what can we do to get involved in the work towards ensuring language access? So basically, going back to our question, how can we advocate or how can we um, be involved to raise awareness or to be at least on top of everything and know what's going on?
Yeah, well, we'll have policy updates and things that come out, so you can definitely follow our work for any
Mhm.
big shifts. But like I think connecting with advocates in your area who are working on this issue, sometimes that might be at the local level, sometimes that might be on the state level, is a great way to understand how potentially you can participate or get involved in these efforts as well. A lot of times the voices of language professionals, I think, are left out of these conversations. So it's always very helpful to have folks who actually are doing the work to provide these services in a lot of cases be able to provide input on policy as well.
I think we have time for one last question. We're at 12:29. Might there potentially be an asymmetry between language access for spoken languages and the laws legislation for that address basically access for deaf and hard of hearing people, such as the ADA? So, how do you see that?
So this has been This has been raised as a parallel where, in a lot of cases, efforts around language access have similarities to efforts to provide access to those who are deaf and hard of hearing. I'm not as much an expert on that area, but I just know this is something that comes up in the field a lot. And in some ways, there are a lot of parallels. But as the person alluded to, the laws that require that are different. So, and the requirements are slightly different. But there is a similarity or a symmetry to them. That's well said.
Hmm. Well, Jacob, thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. The information you've provided will be incredibly valuable for interpreters navigating these policy landscapes. So you're free to go now. Zach and I will stay on for a few minutes to answer any questions about cross-cultural communications. And Jacob, we wish you a wonderful afternoon. Thank you again for being here with us today and answering all of those wonderful questions with even better answers. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. This was great. And I hope this was helpful to everybody sort of understand the current context. But thank you, Liliana, too, for all your great questions. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And everyone, don't forget to follow the MPI, get onto their listserv and just be on top of all of this. So thank you, Jake. Have a good
Thank
day.
you. Take care.